"Please don't leave me," she cried. The giant cowboy carried her across the prairie. The prairie looked endless that evening, a long sweep of gold and dust stretching so far that even the wind seemed tired of crossing it. And the giant cowboy had been walking ahead in his slow, steady way when he heard her voice crack behind him, a small, broken sound that didn't belong to the open land. And he stopped, turned, and saw her stumbling in the wavering heat, her hand pressed against her ribs as if holding herself together. She tried to hide her face when he looked at her, but the tears slipped through her fingers anyway. And when she whispered, "Please, don't leave me," it came out like breath torn from the center of her chest. The kind of fear that didn't come from weakness, but from a life where people had walked away one too many times. He didn't answer with words at first. He rarely did, because talk, in his mind, never weighed as much as action, and instead crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, the earth shaking softly under his boots as he reached her, took one look at how her knees were giving out, and scooped her up in his arms before she could protest. She gasped at the sudden lift, fingers gripping his shirt as if afraid he might change his mind, but he only shifted her closer against his chest, steady as the horizon behind him, and began moving again with the patience of a man carrying something precious that had already been dropped by the world more times than anyone should endure. She kept trying to apologize, small, frantic breaths about being a burden, slowing him down, ruining whatever plan he hadn't told her. But he stopped her with a quiet, "You're fine," spoken in that deep, unhurried voice of his, the kind that didn't ask for belief, but created it. The wind picked up around them, brushing her hair across her face, and she finally let her head fall against his shoulder, exhausted beyond pride, listening to the steady rhythm of his boots meeting the ground. Every step felt like a promise he hadn't spoken yet, every breath like a shield he didn't mind holding up. She was trembling, not from cold, but from everything she'd been running from. The men behind them, the night she escaped, the long fear that even good people didn't stay. And the prairie stretched in every direction like a test she would never pass alone, but he carried her as if the weight meant nothing. As if he had been expecting to pick her up from the moment he saw how she held herself together with more will than strength. When she whispered again, so faint he almost missed it, "You won't leave me, will you?" He didn't slow, didn't shift her weight, didn't lift his head to think it over. He simply tightened his hold by a fraction, enough for her to feel it, but not enough for it to look like anything to anyone else, and said in a tone as certain as the land beneath them, "No, not now, not out here." And for the first time since the day she fled, her breathing steadied, not because she was safe yet, but because she finally believed she wasn't facing the distance alone. The sun hung low as they moved across the open stretch of prairie, throwing long shadows behind them, and though he carried her as if her weight meant nothing, she could feel the slow drag in his breath from hours of crossing ground that offered no mercy to anyone, man or woman. She kept murmuring that she could walk, could try again, could make it just a little farther, but every time she shifted, he felt the tremor in her legs and tightened his grip, silent but firm, letting her know he wasn't about to set her down just to watch her collapse all over again. The land around them felt unforgiving, cracked in places where the heat had split the dirt, rolling in others where tall grass hid dips deep enough to twist an ankle. She watched it over his shoulder, the endless horizon pulsing with a faint shimmer, and wondered how he made it look so easy, How a man built like a giant could move with such steady patience, as though nothing in the world, not the land, not the danger behind them, not even the fear she carried, could knock him off balance. He didn't speak unless necessary, but she'd come to understand that silence was its own kind of protection with him, a shield stronger than most men's promises. Still, the thoughts pressed on her chest until she whispered, barely audible over the wind, "You should have left me when you had the chance." He didn't respond immediately, didn't turn his head or sigh or offer comfort the way gentler men might have. He just kept walking, boots sinking into the earth with a rhythm that soothed and unsettled her all at once, before finally saying, "Don't tell me what I should have done," in a tone that wasn't sharp but solid, like he was correcting a simple untruth. She blinked, startled by the certainty in his voice, and he glanced down at her only long enough for her to see something in his eyes. Not softness exactly, but a quiet decision already made. She had been running for days before he found her, stumbling through brush and dust with nothing but fear pushing her forward. Too ashamed to ask for help, too used to people choosing not to see her. And now that she'd fallen into his path, into his arms, part of her still believed he'd eventually decide the burden wasn't worth carrying. A sudden gust sent a swirl of dust around them, and she buried her face against his collarbone, gripping the front of his shirt, feeling the coarse fabric press against her cheek. He shifted one hand to steady her head gently, though his voice remained steady and low when he added, "You're not slowing me down, just stay still." She swallowed hard, trying to absorb the truth of it, trying to convince herself this wasn't temporary kindness, but something steadier, something real. The prairie wind keened like a warning, brushing through the tall grass ahead, and she tightened her hold as though afraid the distance would swallow them whole. But he never faltered, never once looked back, carrying her with the certainty of a man who had already decided the world had taken enough from her, and he wasn't about to let it take anything more. By the time dusk bled into the prairie, turning every ridge into a dark spine against the fading sky, he had found them a place to stop, a hollow formed by two sloping rises, shielded from the wind but still open enough for him to see anything approaching from a mile out. He lowered her to the ground slowly, as if setting down something fragile, and she tried to stand on her own, only to feel her legs buckle beneath her, the trembling returning with the same stubbornness that fear always carried inside her. He caught her before she hit the earth, one arm locking around her waist with instinctive precision, and she held her breath at the closeness, embarrassed by how weak she felt, but unable to pretend her body wasn't giving out after days of running. He helped her sit on a patch of dry grass, pulled his canteen free, and set it in her hands, watching until she took a long swallow that steadied her shaking. The prairie settled around them in a strange quiet. No bird calls, no insect buzz, just the low hum of wind dragging itself across the ground like something tired from traveling the same path too many times. She stared at her hands as she whispered, "They'll come for me. You know they will." And though she kept her voice even, he heard the tremor buried beneath the words, the kind that came from someone who had learned to expect the worst because the worst had always found its way back. He didn't look away from the horizon when he answered, "Let them," and the simplicity of the words sent a shiver through her, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from the shock of someone refusing to be intimidated by what had broken her. She wanted to tell him everything, why she'd run, what she'd endured, what she'd seen in the eyes of the men chasing her, But when she opened her mouth, the words stuck in her throat, choking her with their weight. He didn't press, didn't push, didn't even turn toward her, just knelt to gather a few dry stems of grass and struck a spark against flint until a small flame flickered to life, its glow painting the planes of his face with a gentleness his size didn't suggest. The fire cracked softly, and she found herself staring at his hands, huge, scarred, capable of violence if needed, yet moving with such steady patience it made her eyes sting. "You don't even know what I did," she whispered, voice raw. He finally glanced at her, and his reply was almost a shrug, spoken in a quiet that landed heavier than anger ever could. "If you had done something worth running from, you wouldn't look so scared to tell it." Her breath broke, a small sound she tried to swallow, and for a moment she pressed her palms to her face, hiding the tears that pushed through despite her efforts. He didn't touch her, didn't offer comfort. He wasn't sure she wanted, but he shifted closer, letting the warmth of the fire and the quiet of his presence wrap around her like a shield. The sky deepened into night, stars pricking through the dark one by one, and though the fear inside her hadn't vanished, it loosened its grip just enough for her to breathe. Because for the first time in too many nights, she wasn't alone on the prairie, and the man beside her wasn't running, wasn't hesitating, wasn't afraid. He was simply there, solid, unshaken, and she didn't know why that made her chest ache, only that it did, and that something in her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this giant cowboy wasn't someone fate had thrown her toward by accident. Night settled fully over the prairie, smothering the last streaks of orange behind the hills, and the cold crept in with a sharpness that made her pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders, while he fed another piece of dry sage into the fire, the sparks rising like scattered stars before vanishing into the dark. She watched him with a cautious curiosity, noticing how his eyes kept sweeping the horizon even while his hands moved with practiced ease, and every time the wind shifted, he straightened just slightly, listening with the kind of instinct that belonged to men who knew the open lands better than they knew any town. She wanted to ask him why he was helping her, why he hadn't asked a single question, why he hadn't demanded to know the whole story before risking himself. But the words tangled in her mind, blocking her throat. Instead, she whispered, "You don't have to stay up all night," and he shook his head just once, slow and final. "Sleep. I'll watch," he said, the certainty in his tone so steady it made her chest tighten with something unfamiliar, a feeling that almost hurt because it felt too safe, too undeserved. She lay down near the fire, still trembling faintly, not from cold now, but from the memory of the hands that had reached for her in the dark 2 nights ago, the shouts, the threats, the way she'd sprinted across the prairie barefoot until her lungs burned raw. She thought sleep wouldn't come, not with fear still pressing against her ribs, but his presence, quiet, unmoving, unwavering, pulled her toward rest. She drifted for moments at a time, slipping between wakefulness and dreams until a sound snapped her fully awake, the distant rhythm of hooves. She jolted upright, clutching the blanket, eyes wide. Before she could make a sound, he was already on his feet, one massive hand lowering gently toward her shoulder in a steadying gesture. "Stay behind me," he murmured, voice so calm it startled her more than the danger did. The hooves grew louder, echoing across the prairie like a warning drumbeat. She could feel her breath shorten as shadows appeared on the ridge. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving with the kind of slow certainty that told her they weren't lost, weren't wandering. They were looking for her. Panic surged in her chest, flooding her with the familiar helplessness she'd been trying to outrun. But before it could swallow her, he stepped forward, planting himself between her and the riders, broad shoulders blocking the firelight, silhouette towering like a wall carved out of the earth itself. He didn't reach for a rifle. He didn't raise a weapon at all. He simply stood there with that massive, unshakable calm, as if daring the night itself to try and take one step closer. The riders hesitated at the crest, whispering among themselves, their shapes barely lit by the thinnest silver of moonlight. She could see their hesitation, see the way they reconsidered when faced with the man willing to stand alone between them and the tiny fire below. After a tense moment, the hooves turned, fading into the distance, swallowed by the dark. She let out a broken breath she'd been holding for too long, pressing both hands to her mouth as the reality settled in. They had come for her. And he had sent them away without speaking a single word. When he turned back toward her, his expression was unreadable in the flickering firelight, but his voice was soft when he said, "You're safe for tonight." And somehow, hearing those words from him steadied her in a way she hadn't felt in months. Because for the first time since running, she believed them. By morning, the prairie felt gentler, softened by a pale gold light that stretched over the grasses and chased the night shadows into the far ridges. But she still woke with a startled breath, sitting upright before she remembered where she was, beside a dying fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of sage and horse, with the giant cowboy crouched near the ashes, coaxing a small flame back to life as if he'd never slept at all. He glanced at her only briefly, enough to check she was awake, then returned to breaking twigs with those massive hands that somehow moved with the quiet precision of someone who had learned long ago how to make his strength gentle. She pulled the blanket closer, embarrassed by how much comfort she took from simply seeing him still there. "You didn't sleep," she whispered, voice hoarse. "Didn't need to," he replied, though the bruised dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt too small for what he'd done, too thin for a night where he stood between her and danger without asking for anything in return. Instead, she sat beside him, letting the silence settle until it pressed against her chest with the same weight as everything she'd kept hidden. He must have sensed the tension tightening her shoulders, because he finally asked, low and steady, "What are you running from?" It wasn't a demand, it was a door, offered without force. She stared at her hands, fingers twisting together until her knuckles whitened, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. The words stayed trapped behind her teeth like they always did. Her throat burning with the shame of memories she didn't choose to carry. But the quiet around them, the wind sighing across the grass, the soft crackle of growing flame, his steady breath, finally loosened something inside her. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, and once she began, the rest poured out in fragments, her voice breaking, stopping, then pushing forward as the story clawed its way free. She told him about the foreman's son, the way he cornered her in the barn, the way no one believed her when she screamed, how his father blamed her, called her a liar, and sent men after her when she escaped before they could drag her back. Each word felt like ripping open a wound that had never healed, and she couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see disgust or doubt or the judgment she'd met everywhere else. But when she finally lifted her gaze, expecting the worst, she froze. He wasn't angry at her. He was furious for her. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with a restrained fury that scared her for a moment, not because she feared him, but because she realized he cared. "You did nothing wrong," he said, the words rough but controlled, like he was wrestling with the urge to ride straight to that ranch and end every man who'd hunted her. "They hurt you, and then they hunted you. That's on them, not you." Her breath broke, tears blurring the world again, but this time they felt different, not shameful, not weak, but releasing something she had held too long. He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her, just shifted a little closer so she could lean if she chose. And she did, slowly, hesitantly, letting her shoulder rest against the broad strength of his arm, feeling his steady warmth grounding her like the first safe place she'd found in months. For a long moment they stayed like that, the truth between them, the prairie wind carrying her sobs away. And when she finally whispered, "I didn't think anyone would believe me," his answer was simple but carried more weight than anything she'd ever heard. "I believe you, and no one who hurt you will ever touch you again." That promise settled into her like a heartbeat, steady and undeniable. And for the first time since she'd run, she felt something close to hope. After she finished speaking, the quiet between them changed. No longer the tense, trembling silence of someone holding a secret too heavy to carry, but the softer kind that follows truth finally let loose. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed by how much she'd cried, and he rose to his feet without commenting on her tears, instead scanning the horizon as though measuring how far they could travel before trouble caught their trail again. "We should move," he said simply, and she nodded, surprising herself with how steady her legs felt when he helped her stand, his hand resting lightly at her elbow. Not gripping, not claiming, just guiding. They packed quickly, him kicking dirt over the fire, her folding the blanket even though her fingers still trembled with the aftershocks of fear and confession. When she handed it back to him, he didn't take it right away. Instead, he looked down at her with an expression she couldn't read at first, something between concern and a quiet kind of respect, as if speaking her truth had altered the way he saw her. "You're tougher than you think," he murmured, before turning to cinch the straps on his horse. The words hit her with more force than she expected. Tough, not foolish, not weak. Tough. She followed him onto the open prairie, the wind sharp but clean against her skin. He rode slightly ahead, leading the horse she sat upon, his shoulders set in that steady, unshakable posture that had become her anchor in all this. Every so often he glanced back, checking that she was still upright, still breathing evenly, still with him. And each time their eyes met, her chest tightened with an unfamiliar warmth, the kind that didn't feel like fear at all. They rode for nearly 2 hours before he slowed near a rise overlooking a broad sweep of land dotted with cottonwoods. He lifted her down from the horse with the same care he'd shown since the moment he found her, his hands spanning her waist easily, lowering her as though she weighed nothing. She tried to step away, to thank him, to gather herself, but a sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it a sound she recognized instantly. Distant shouts, carried thin on the air. Her breath hitched. He heard it too, his body stilled in an instant, a predator's alertness tightening every muscle as he turned toward the sound. The wind shifted again, and this time she could make out words, her name, called in a harsh voice she knew too well. Her stomach nodded. "They're closer than I thought," he said, his voice low but steady. She felt her knees weaken. All the fear she'd poured out to him that morning flooded back like a breaking dam, drowning the fragile hope she'd only just begun to feel. Without thinking, she stepped closer to him, clutching the sleeve of his coat. "What do we do?" she whispered. He looked down at her, and something in his expression shifted, a decision settling over him like a shadow. "We draw them off the trail," he said, turning toward the southern pass, "and we buy you time." Her heart lurched. "We?" He shook his head once. "No, just me." Panic flared sharp in her chest. She grabbed both his hands, breath breaking as she whispered, "Please, don't leave me, not now." For the first time since she met him, something cracked in his composure. His jaw tightened, his eyes softened, and his hands, huge, scarred, capable, closed around hers with a gentleness that undid her completely. "I'm not leaving you," he said, voice rough with something she didn't dare name. "But I am ending this." Before she could argue, before she could even catch her breath, he swung onto his horse, pulled her close enough to touch his forehead to hers for one brief, burning second, and whispered, "Stay hidden, trust me." Then he rode, giant, fierce, unstoppable, straight toward the men who had hunted her, and the wind carried her name once more. But this time, it wasn't shouted in threat. It was spoken in a promise. The moment he disappeared down the slope, the world around her seemed to collapse into two sounds. The thunder of his horse's hooves fading into the distance, and her own heartbeat pounding hard enough to shake her ribs. She crouched low behind the ridge, fingers digging into the dry earth, forcing herself to stay hidden just as he'd ordered, even though every piece of her wanted to run after him, to pull him back, to tell him she didn't care about the danger as long as he stayed within reach. But his last words hadn't been a request. They had been a vow, spoken in that deep, steady tone that made even terror stop and listen. So she stayed still, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the horizon where he rode like a storm breaking loose. Below, the prairie opened into a wide, sweeping basin, sun glaring off the plains in pale gold sheets. And she could just barely make out the figures of the men chasing her. 4 riders, mean silhouettes carved against the dust they kicked up. When they saw him charging toward them alone, they slowed for a heartbeat, confused. Why would a man ride into danger instead of away from it? The answer came a moment later, when he leaned forward in the saddle, shoulders dropping into a predator's tilt. He wanted them to see him, to follow him, to forget about her entirely, and it worked. The lead rider shouted, pointing his rifle at the giant cowboy barreling straight toward them, and the others pivoted their horses, redirecting their hunt. Her breath caught. She was safe, for now. But he was not. The tallest rider raised his gun and fired. She clapped a hand over her mouth to smother a cry, but the giant cowboy ducked low, the bullet slicing harmlessly through the air where his head had been a second earlier. He swung his horse sharply, circling wide, drawing the men farther from the ridge with every passing second. He didn't fire back, didn't even reach for his weapon. He wasn't trying to kill them, he was trying to buy her time. That was when she truly understood the risk he'd taken. He wasn't just distracting them, he was sacrificing his safety for hers. Her eyes burned hot. She could feel every hoof fall in her chest, as if his heartbeat and her own were tangled together across the distance. The men gave chase, shouting curses, bullets snapping through the grass behind him. He rode like a man who had outrun fear long ago, leaning into the wind with that raw, unstoppable strength she'd felt when he lifted her. For a moment, she wondered how a stranger, a giant cowboy who owed her nothing, could fight this hard for someone he barely knew. But then she remembered the way he'd looked at her when she begged him not to leave, the fierce, protective grief in his eyes. And she understood. He saw something in her worth saving, even if she didn't yet believe it herself. Suddenly the sound of a rifle cracked from the ridge's far side. She spun toward it, heart slamming. A fifth rider, a hidden one, was circling behind her position. The men chasing him were a distraction too, she realized, but not in the way she'd thought. One of them had broken off and was coming straight for her. Fear exploded in her chest. She backed away, stumbling against the rocks, searching desperately for somewhere to hide, somewhere he'd find her when he returned. If he returned. Below, the giant cowboy must have seen the danger, because he yanked his horse to a dead stop, turned in the saddle, and roared her name in a voice that carried across the entire prairie. He wasn't close enough to reach her. She wasn't fast enough to outrun the rider closing in. And in that terrifying instant, when death and salvation raced toward the same point, she realized something with a clarity sharper than fear itself. She wasn't just scared of losing her life. She was scared of losing him. The moment she heard him shout her name across the prairie, something inside her snapped. The kind of sharp, instinctive panic that didn't come from fear alone, but from the terrifying certainty that he was too far away to save her, and yet would still try, even if it killed him. She stumbled backward over the loose stones of the ridge, eyes locked on the lone rider charging toward her with a rifle raised, dust spiraling behind his horse like a wildfire tail. And for one heartbeat she froze, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to believe the danger had found its way to her again, despite everything the giant cowboy had done to pull it away. Down below, far across the bowl of the prairie, he yanked his horse around with a violence that sent clods of earth exploding beneath the hooves. And without hesitation, he abandoned the chase he'd been leading, driving his mount straight uphill toward her in a brutal, impossible sprint that no ordinary rider could have even attempted. Her hands shook so hard she could barely push herself upright, her back scraping the rock behind her as she tried to climb higher, but there was nowhere left to go. The ridge ended in a drop too steep to survive, and the rider coming for her was close enough now that she could see the sneer on his face, the way he leaned forward in his saddle like a man already imagining his victory. She braced herself, knowing she couldn't outrun him, couldn't fight him, couldn't do anything except hope the giant cowboy reached her in time, even though logic said he couldn't, even though the distance between them was too great and the slope too steep and the seconds too few. But he didn't slow, he didn't think, he didn't question. He rode like a force of nature unleashed, shoulders low, jaw set, each stride of his horse devouring ground with terrifying speed. And then she saw something in his posture shift, a violent intention, a line crossed, just as the rider coming for her raised his rifle to fire. She dropped to her knees instinctively, squeezing her eyes shut as the gunshot cracked the air apart, a vicious echo bouncing off the ridge walls, but the bullet never reached her. When she looked up, breath ragged, she realized the rider had aimed not at her, but at the ground near her feet, trying to scare her into scrambling downhill where he could grab her easily. The tactic worked. Almost. She slipped, sliding a foot downward before catching herself on a jut of stone, and the rider grinned, spurring his horse closer to finish the job. Then the world erupted. The giant cowboy slammed into the other rider from the side with the sheer force of a charging bull, his horse skidding in a spray of dirt as he crashed shoulder first into the man who had nearly reached her. The impact sent both horses rearing, the attacker tumbling hard onto the ground, while the giant cowboy sprang out of his saddle before it had even stopped moving. She'd never seen a man that large move so fast. He grabbed the fallen rider by the collar and hauled him upright with one arm, the other ripping the rifle from his grip before tossing it aside like garbage. The attacker swung wildly in panic, but the giant cowboy caught his fist mid-air, crushed the man's wrist until he screamed, and shoved him backward so hard he flattened against the dirt. "You don't touch her," he growled, voice so deep it vibrated through the ground beneath her knees. "Not now, not ever." She stared at him, chest heaving, tears blurring her vision. Not because of fear now, but because he had turned back. He had turned back for her. He could have escaped. He could have ridden to safety. He could have chosen logic over instinct, but he didn't. He chose her. He always chose her. And when he climbed the last few steps of the ridge and lifted her into his arms, strong, breathless, shaking with the aftershock of what he'd nearly lost, she buried her face against his chest, letting the truth she had been running from settle all the way into her bones. She wasn't alone anymore, not while he was breathing. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want him to ever let her go. Night pressed over the prairie like a heavy blanket, the kind that didn't offer comfort, but instead forced every sound to echo twice, first in the air, then inside the bones. And as the giant cowboy carried her toward the small outcropping of boulders where he planned to build a temporary camp, she could feel the tension running through him like a drawn wire. Every muscle in his massive frame coiled with the raw, silent fury he hadn't let loose back on the ridge. She clung to him, not because she was weak, but because she was shaking from the memory of how close she'd come to being dragged away, and because something about the steady rise and fall of his breath against her cheek made her feel grounded again, tethered to a reality where she wasn't abandoned on a cold trail, wasn't prey to men who wanted to break and claim her, wasn't begging someone to stay. When he set her down gently beside the boulders, she watched him move with a kind of focused ferocity, gathering dry grass, snapping branches, striking flint, every motion sharp, efficient, bordering on violent in the way a man behaves when he's holding too much inside. The fire sparked to life in a small, controlled flame, and the glow brushed over his features, revealing his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle ticking beneath the skin. "You're hurt," he said finally, his voice low and rough, though she hadn't complained once as he'd carried her. "Show me." She hesitated. Instinct, pride, fear blending into something tangled. But he stepped closer, kneeling in front of her so she didn't have to look up at him, his size suddenly not overwhelming, but protective. Like he was trying to shrink his world until it fit safely around her. She lifted her foot to show him the torn skin from where she'd slipped on the rocks, and he examined it with a gentleness that didn't match the strength of his hands. "It's not bad," he said, but the crack in his voice betrayed the truth. It could have been. She could have been. She could have been lost today. "I should have never left you alone," he muttered, anger turned inward now, his breath shaking the smallest bit. He almost... She reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing his forearm, stopping him mid-sentence. "You came back," she whispered. "You always come back." He lifted his gaze, and for a moment she saw something raw in his eyes. Fear, relief, the hollow echo of what could have happened. I heard you cry, he said. And there ain't a force on this earth that could have kept me from turning around. The admission stole the breath from her lungs. He wasn't a man of pretty words. He was made of action, of grit, of the silent promise carried in every step he took toward danger instead of away from it. So hearing him confess something so vulnerable made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't name. The fire popped, sending a soft spray of sparks into the air, and he shifted closer, still on his knees, his massive frame casting a protective shadow across her. She should have looked away. She should have steadied herself. Instead, she whispered the words that had lived in her throat all day, the ones she'd shouted when she thought she was losing him forever. Please, don't leave me. His breath hitched, a subtle, almost unnoticeable sound. But on a man like him, it was thunder. He moved a single hand to the side of her face, his thumb brushing away the dirt and fear that still clung to her skin. I won't, he said, the vow quiet but absolute. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not when you're scared, not when you're strong. You hear me? You're not alone anymore. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch without meaning to, feeling the heat from the fire and the warmth from him merge into something that wrapped around her like a second heartbeat. For the first time since the day she'd been left on the prairie, since she'd cried herself sore, begging someone to stay, she believed someone meant it. When he pulled her gently into his chest, settling her between his arms as the fire crackled low beside them, she let herself breathe fully for the first time in days. Not because the danger was gone, but because he was here, because he stayed, because he chose her even when it cost him everything. And as the prairie wind curled soft around them and the night held its breath, she wondered if she'd ever be the same girl again, the one who thought no one would ever fight for her, carry her, or come back when she cried. Tonight proved she was wrong. Tonight proved someone would. Tonight she finally let herself believe it. Dawn crept over the prairie in slow, pale strokes, the kind of soft morning light that made the world feel gentler than it had any right to be after a night like theirs. And as she stirred against the giant cowboy's chest, she realized she hadn't woken to fear, not to the echo of footsteps or the jolt of a nightmare, but to the steady anchoring weight of his arm around her, his breath warm against the top of her head, his heartbeat a slow, unshakable rhythm beneath her cheek. She stayed still for a moment, listening to it, memorizing it, as if some part of her still didn't trust the morning not to take him away. But when she shifted slightly, his arm tightened instinctively, holding her just a little closer, and she felt the truth settle deep inside her. He wasn't letting go. Not now, not after last night, not after everything. When she finally sat up, brushing her tangled hair away from her face, he opened his eyes with that slow, heavy-lidded awareness of a man who hadn't slept deeply in far too long. And the first thing he looked at wasn't the horizon or the dying fire or the fading tracks of the men who had chased her. It was her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep, concern, and something quieter beneath it. She nodded, though the lump in her throat made the motion harder than it should have been. "Because," he continued, pushing himself up with one hand while the other brushed dust from her shoulder, "I meant what I said last night. I ain't going anywhere." She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, because even hearing those words in daylight felt overwhelming. She wasn't used to anyone choosing her after sunrise. She'd been the girl people left behind, the one who watched backs instead of faces, who learned that silence followed promises, and that doors closed louder when she begged them not to. Yet here he was, sitting across from her with the morning sun catching in his dark hair, making him look impossibly solid, like someone carved out of the land itself and sworn to protect whatever he held. She looked down at her hands, still trembling faintly. "I'm not used to this," she whispered. "To someone staying." He reached for her chin, gently, lifting her face until she met his eyes. "Then get used to me," he said, and nothing had ever sounded truer. He stood slowly, towering in the early light, his shadow long across the earth, then offered his hand down to her, not commanding, not assuming, just offering the way he always did. Like her choosing to take, it mattered just as much to him as anything he might choose himself. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their fingers interlaced, she felt the same grounding certainty she'd felt last night when he carried her. She was safe. He pulled her to her feet and didn't let go even after she was steady, instead shifting her closer as if checking every inch of her for fear, for pain, for whatever pieces of last night still clung to her. "We'll head east to my place," he said quietly. "You'll rest proper, eat proper, and nobody will lay a hand on you again." Her breath caught at the absolute conviction in his voice, at the way he made protection sound like a promise carved into stone. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Why do you care this much?" "You don't even know me." Something flickered in his eyes then, something honest, raw, unshielded. "I know enough," he said. "I know you cried for someone to stay. I know you didn't deserve to be left out here alone. And I know that when you reached for me last night, something in me decided I wasn't letting you go." Her eyes burned, but this time the tears weren't from fear. "What if I slow you down?" she whispered. "What if I'm trouble?" He stepped closer, setting his forehead gently against hers, a gesture so tender it nearly buckled her knees. "Then I'll carry you," he murmured, "across the whole damn prairie if I have to." The wind stirred around them with the faint scent of morning sage. The fire crackled into nothing but ash, and the first warmth of sunlight touched the earth, warming her face, warming his hand wrapped around hers, warming the pieces of her heart she'd forgotten how to use. She leaned into him, letting the truth settle finally, completely. She wasn't alone on this prairie. Not anymore. And for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she didn't fear the day ahead, because she wasn't facing it alone. He was beside her. He was staying. He'd chosen her. And as they walked together toward whatever waited beyond the rising horizon, she felt something new unfurl inside her. Something quiet, steady, brave. Hope.